everyone. Wardens, my lords, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the World Traders Tacitus Debate. The company's Tacitus Lecture has become a very popular city event, and in February this year, the 29th lecture was given by Sir Paul Tucker on the subject, A New International Monetary System in a New World Order. The Tacitus Debate is a more recent addition to our calendar of events, and this year is only the third time that we've gathered together a panel of experts to discuss some of the issues raised in the main lecture. The topic chosen for this evening is, should international monetary policy and global foreign policy be inextricably linked? My role this evening is simply to introduce our panel, which I will do in alphabetical order. Full biographies are contained in the brochure for the event, which you should have on your seats, so I hope the panel will forgive me for being brief so as not to take too much time from the debate itself. Firstly, the chairman for this evening is Lord Clement Jones, Tim, who is also chairman of the company's Tacitus Committee. Tim is the London managing partner of DLA Piper and chairman of its China and Middle East desks. A communications professional and a solicitor, he was group company secretary and legal advisor of Kingfisher plc from 1986 to 1995, and before that held senior positions at Grand Metropolitan and London Weekend Television. Tim was chairman and subsequently treasurer of the Liberal Democrats and has held a number of posts in the party since then. He also has a wide range of charitable involvements. He was made a life peer in 1998. David Coultry is chairman of the Commercial Education Trust, an independent grant-making charity which funds projects and research relevant to commercial education and seeks to embed in education at every level the means by which people can apply their learning to their work. Commercial Education Trust is a long-term sponsor of the Tacitus Lecture and more recently of the debate. David was born in Ayrshire and educated at Ayr Academy and Strathclyde University, where he studied architecture. He's enjoyed an international career in transport infrastructure and urban planning, and has held positions as a director of London Transport International and Eurotunnel, as well as having worked as a CEO for UK and American consultancies. Simon Derrick is Managing Director of the Bank of New York Mellon, which is also a sponsor of this evening's debate. Simon is head of the bank's Global Market Strategy team, which he established 17 years ago, and has been responsible for its development into one of the preeminent voices in the foreign exchange markets. His views on currency wars and on developments within the Eurozone are frequently quoted in the financial media. Vicky Price is an economist and international business consultant and a board member and chief economic advisor of the Centre for Economics and Business Research. She was previously Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting, Director General for Economics at the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, and Joint Head of the UK Government Economic Service. Before that, she was a partner at London Economics and partner and chief economist at KPMG. At various stages in her career, she's held academic appointments, including visiting professorships at Queen Mary University London, Imperial College Business School and Cass Business School. Brigid Rosewell is an influential economist with a track record in advising public and private sector clients on key strategic issues. She's a founder and senior advisor of Volterra Partners, a non-executive director of Network Rail and of Ulster Bank. She's a commissioner for the National Infrastructure Commission. She was chief economic advisor to the Greater London Authority from 2002 to 2012, responsible for all transport and economic impact analysis. Her book, Reinventing London, was published in 2014. She was appointed OBE in July 2013, and she's a fellow of the Institute of Civil Engineers. Well, I hope you agree that we have a very distinguished panel this evening to discuss the topic, and I will now hand over to Tim to start the debate. Thank you.
Wendy, thank you very much indeed. And I just want to add to Wendy's welcome It's a great pleasure not only to host tonight, but also to chair it. I don't know whether it goes with the territory. Maybe it does, but it's very good to be here and have you all in such numbers come along to, in a sense, the second half of the Tacitus experience, perhaps I should call it. And of course, many of you came to the lecture, and I hope that you've reread, if you've had the opportunity, the transcript of the lecture by Sir Paul, because really it was a masterclass in the subject. And of course, all masterclasses leave you with some ambiguity. And I think many of us I think many of us have some differences with Sir Paul in his analysis, but I think the central thesis was that geopolitics and monetary policy, strategy, if you like, have been decoupled for most purposes, except for sort of key times like Bretton Woods and so on. But at other times, perhaps they should have been much more closely conjuncted. And will be in the future. And of course, what he did was pose a number of different scenarios, which I thought were extremely interesting. The kind of mercantilism scenario, where he was really talking about competition between currencies, in a sense, reserve currencies, and a kind of zero-sum game. He talked about, I suppose, where certain superpowers, the US, China, were really setting the pace. And then, of course, the sunlit uplands of shared interests, where I suppose we had this beneficial agreement between the various countries with reserve currencies and so on. And I suppose the backdrop to much of it was the fact that the West is less influential, or probably going to be less influential in the future in being able to dictate the situation, where we have a much more sort of multipolar situation on the currencies. But he also got into other sorts of areas in terms of setting interest rates and so on, which I'm afraid that's the point where not being a banker or a foreign currency specialist, and I'm relying very much on our panel at this point, I wasn't able to travel those distances, but I certainly found the central thesis of great interest, and one very much worth pursuing. So what we tried to do was to boil down the question arising from Sir Paul's lecture into a sort of exam question, which, as with all exam questions, probably none of our panel will attempt to answer. They'll probably answer the question that they arrived with in their own heads, which will be far more entertaining. It'll be, but the question, as you can see from your Tacitus literature, is: should international monetary policy and global foreign policy be inextricably linked? And you can answer that, of course, in different ways: should, would, can, has been, in all sorts of different tenses. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what our panel have to say. And invidiously, I've given the panel the order in which they're going to bat. And I'm going to start off with Vicky Price, who I know is fully aware of exactly the implications of the exam question. Vicky.
Well, thank you very much. I wish that was the case. I mean, the interesting thing is that a number of us had a discussion with Tim before over the phone, where we interpreted what we heard from Paul in a certain way. And then, of course, we read the text. And it wasn't quite what we thought at the time. There were lots of bits that he had added, of course, which he must have edited out somehow or other. Or at least whoever had done the report for him, or the note, had decided not to put these things, and he added them himself. So we had quite a lot about QE and things like that, quantitative easing, which were not actually in the text that we read. So then we had to rethink, was he actually saying that the two things are not related, and there are different people making decisions on the financial side, economic side, and different ones on foreign policy? And I suspect he was slightly influenced by where he has been in the last few months, which is the US, where indeed I think it's quite interesting when you look at the think tanks there. They have foreign policy think tanks, and they have economic think tanks. And it's quite interesting how they don't quite merge the way that they do here. I mean, here, our economic think tanks are really policy think tanks because they all have a political dimension before they even start doing economics. And of course, being an economist, I had always argued that economics and politics are inextricably linked. The question, of course, is how do you do it right in an environment where there is such interconnectedness across? And where, of course, there are all these countries emerging, which also want to have a position at the top table, which is, of course, what's going on now with China and what may be happening with many other countries in the future. And it is also an environment where you have no capital controls to speak of. Yes, there are still restrictions in various places, but in reality, the markets move. Short-term capital can decide that interest rates in one place are perhaps not as high as they should be, and they therefore decide to go somewhere else. Look what's going on today about the yen, where suddenly the yen is going up, when of course everything you can see about the Japanese economy should suggest that the yen should in fact be going down. They've just decided not to inflate the economy. The yen should in fact therefore be declining. But because of the US not being likely to raise interest rates as much as it was going to do before, and you look at the unemployment figures every time they come out, and it's very frequent, and you decide that whether they're going to go up or not. And certainly the US Fed has changed its mind on this, on the rapidity, if you like, of how fast interest rates will rise. The yen suddenly goes up. And the issue therefore is who takes responsibility for these things which can actually, your interest rate policy can influence much more widely what happens in the world, and particularly, and being Greek, of course, I know that very well indeed and painfully, small, rather open economies which are completely left to suffer from whatever may be happening internationally, including the fact that a number of institutions decided to invest in subprime mortgages in the US. Now, how does that particularly relate to the individual in the street in Athens who is a civil servant, let's say? So this interconnectedness is really important, and therefore the obligations, if you like, of individual policymakers in the big countries are actually quite substantial. And for me, it's quite interesting that after the recession, there was indeed, since you mentioned interest rates, a general agreement among the monetary authorities to lower interest rates, because that would in fact help the world economy. And that is, of course, exactly what happened and has stayed the case for a long period of time. And then, of course, the US goes and raises rates. It thought it was about time it did that, but what did it do? We can just see this interconnectedness. We may think it's all sorts of other things, the slowdown in China and everything else, but if you track down, and perhaps we have people who know that better on this panel, when the market started feeling very jittery around Christmas and after, it is really very much connected to the US deciding to do something different to everybody else. With the result, of course, that all those countries that have dollar-denominated debt, in Southeast Asia, for example, in South America, found themselves in a terrible situation, and it has accelerated their decline into recession. So one move and pronouncements by Yellen, the head of the Federal Reserve, can actually affect significantly what goes on around you. So there is an added responsibility. Does this mean that whoever is running the economics and financial side is really completely unconnected to foreign policy? Well, I would say that at times they make mistakes, like this one. And of course we need to think of a new world order. How exactly do you get, new currencies that may be very important, a multipolar world of the sort that has just been described, to work properly? What are the responsibilities across? What types of swap arrangements do you have between the various currencies? How do you limit the holdings of US dollars in various places so that you don't have this impact if the dollar goes up or goes down, which can be very, very significant? It affects oil prices, etc. How do you do that? That is something that Paul touched on. He didn't actually have an answer, but it certainly is a very, very important thing we're doing now. But if you just look back at foreign policy and economics, you do find how a number of instances recently where, of course, the two are connected. You can look at that, for example, in everything that China has done in terms of investing in resources in Africa and actually controlling quite a lot of what happens in those countries as well. Look at the sanctions we have imposed on Russia. That is economics and politics, in other words, foreign policy, completely aligned. Look at what's going on in Cuba. The sanctions, of course, affected Cuba economically. There were economic sanctions in order to achieve a political aim. Look at Iran and the easing of sanctions now so that you can actually get a rapprochement with Iran, a very, very significant part of this. Look at the EU and Turkey, the way in which, of course, we are allowing, or will allow, possibly, Turks to travel freely in Europe in exchange, we give them also extra money in exchange for controlling migration. And it has already had some effect in terms of easing the flows. So there are politics and economics, and examples of politics and economics actually being very, very closely aligned. They may not always be perfect. The main fact achieve the opposite aim, which has happened occasionally, and I think we didn't do Ukraine particularly well, for example. But it is still the case that economics is used in order to further foreign aims. Now, the question, of course, is, are those foreign aims good for all of us? Are they done in a coordinated fashion? At times they're not. And I think the worst thing that could happen, I think, to finish off, I would say that Paul was absolutely right, is if we move towards protectionism, which says not only economically, but also in terms of foreign policy, we don't, in fact, care about what happens elsewhere. Of course, there is debate right now with the contenders for the presidency in the US, which might move us in that direction. We already saw a little bit under the Obama administration of perhaps retreating a little bit in terms of those obligations. But I think that maybe Paul was looking at it too much from a US perspective. I think for the rest of the world, the two, in my mind, are very closely interlinked, and that hasn't changed. Thank you.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed. And raising the spectre of Donald Trump, I mean, this is a great start today. So I think we'll continue on a high.
Is that a high?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. A high of anxiety, I think, more than anything else. Now, I'm going to give you some unusual advice. If you want to tweet, please do. We have Wi-Fi. You'll see from your on your chairs that you can link up with our Wi-Fi here. So please, if there's something particularly interesting that one of our speakers says, and I'm sure you already found things in what Vicky had to say that you'd like to tell the world, do. We just want to stimulate the conversation with those who are unable to be with us today. Brigid, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to try and start where Vicky left off, I think, and take us off in a slightly different direction, hopefully add another perspective. And I suppose my answer to the question is not should, it's just they are. So international monetary relations and global foreign policy and how those are related has been a fact of life for as long as, going back to Tacitus, as Paul has pointed out in his introduction. He says that these are now converging. I think it's actually more that they're diverging, and that's the challenge that we are faced with. So in periods of stable world order, paxes of various kinds, whether they're Romana Britannica or Americana, America is the imperial power as in current circumstances. If everybody's kind of either bought in or have been forced to buy in to that particular solution, then it can seem as if these things are independent of one another. But actually that's only because you're in that period where the rules of the game are pretty well understood by the people who are enough of the time. There will always be rebels and revolutionaries and indeed terrorists. But so long as the rules are being kind of reasonably well understood by the people who are implementing them, then we have that convergence which then seems to be invisible. We're now currently in a period where that's not invisible. And the risk, I guess, of that period of where this you get these shifts, the tectonic plates of international policy are moving around, then that's a risky period, obviously. And particularly risky for those who were benefiting from the previous rules of the game, because there are always winners and losers. And it is, after all, another quote from Tacitus I thought I might just throw into the pot at this point. he ascribes this statement actually to a chieftain somewhere in the north of England, a bit unspecified actually. The Romans come, they create desolation, and they call it peace. So the risk when you move from one set of rules to another is that you get it wrong, and humans after all make mistakes, we all do it all the time, and so we end up with the desolation solution, even though it might be very peaceful. So I suppose what I want to do is think about where the institutions are which, if you like, corral those relationships. There's a power play going on after all out there. There's a power play between the newly emerging very large economies, China most obviously, but India is in there too. I'm not so sure about the South Americans. I think that they're really struggling to get enough political economy together to warrant the bricks have fallen. The bricks have fallen apart in that sense. But nonetheless, there are new, very strong, powerful players wanting their seat on the world stage and prepared to fight for it if need be, and physically indeed if need be. Money arrived in the first instance because armies need paying, and that's why the stuff got invented, as many historians have pointed out, and that truth still applies. Armies are still the biggest employer in the world, is apparently, I don't know how we would know this actually, but the story is that it's the Chinese army. Of course, the second biggest is apparently the National Health Service in the UK. I'm not sure if I believe that one either, but nonetheless, lots of people prepared, if necessary, to go to war, and that is really what we mostly need to avoid. So what are the compromises that we might need to make in international monetary arrangements to make it possible for that to happen? And I think there are two things that we really need to think about in thinking about that. One of them is banks and bankers, and so I think that's very relevant to where we are at the moment. And sorry, just having thought about bankers, I've forgotten what the other one is, so let's just concentrate on the bankers for the moment. What we need is the institutional arrangements for banking which enable the smooth flow of transactions which appear to be beneficial to people's ordinary lives. That's a challenge, because the 2008 crisis made us all generally be pariahs. If you say you're a banker, I'm on the board of a bank, in fact I'm actually on the board of two at the moment, and you sometimes you're slightly careful who you might say that to, in case you're seen to be one of those evil people who lends money badly and then demands it back with menaces. And that is a real challenge because at the end of the day, international monetary arrangements will depend upon the ability of a banking system to finance trade, to finance businesses, and to show that the use of money and monetary arrangements across countries and between countries and within countries are socially beneficial. So I think that's one thing that we really need to think about, how we do that, and indeed how in doing so we kind of perhaps unwind some of the large number of transactions which flow across the system and which may not be as I'm not going to say they're not beneficial, but they don't look to be as beneficial as you might hope. And that actually leads to the second thing. I don't know how I managed to go blank on this for a moment, because it's the elephant in all our rooms, which is debt. We have these huge international imbalances which have built up, most notably between the US and China, but actually our own is not terrifically anything to write home about either. We owe too much money across the globe. The West particularly owes it to the East, and you can shout all you like about the need to change exchange rates so that you can unwind some of these, but the creditor nations, we've seen this for decades, generations, back into the post-war period. Creditor nations never want to devalue so that their debts become less, and they rescue the position of their creditors. Getting that to happen between allies is hard. Getting it to happen between countries that are not allied, and where the benefit of doing so may be so long-term, and Paul makes this point, the benefit of doing so may look too long-term for your domestic populations, that is actually even harder. So I don't think it's enough to think about the sort of the individual small countries certainly are a challenge and an issue, but actually it's these really big movements between, if you like, the proto and the actual imperial powers of the US, China. Japan's an interesting one because after it came up and then went down again, it burdened itself too much too quickly with its own debt. But China is the creditor nation. They're the ones who actually are owed the money. So how do we get to a position where we unwind some of those balances across the globe? And in doing so, equally, actually, we also need to unwind some of the domestic balances too. The individual indebtedness of households in the US in particular is quite dramatic still. Everybody has brought down their indebtedness, down probably about 10-15% across the whole piece in the West. But that still leaves most households with debts that they will find really struggle to pay off with the kind of growth rates of the economy that we have. That, of course, is destabilising domestically as well, and one of the other reasons why it's going to be hard to unwind this. So I think banks are crucial to this. So my challenge is to all of us in this room, how are we going to help create that unwind? I could go on, but I'll stop at that point.
Brigid, thank you very much indeed. That's a terrific and taking the whole argument on. And then I'm going to come to Simon.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Sim. Brigid mentioned Tacitus's comments about the north of England. I'm from the north of England. I think I know where he meant when he said it was quite so desolate. I wanted to pick up a few points. I think that the first thing I really want to pick up from what Brigid said was monetary policy and currency policy has always had an impact on foreign policy issues. I think there's no question about that. So I think that has been particularly true over the course of the post-Nixon shock era. You can go back and think about the 1970s. Would we have had the events of the late 1970s? The oil price hadn't been high. Would the oil prices have reached the heights they reached in 1979? If it hadn't been for a Federal Reserve that run monetary policy quite so hot through the 1970s? Probably not. I think, though, the fascinating bit about this question is, has that relationship changed over the course of the last 15 years? Has it become more extreme? And I think the answer is yes, because I believe that what we've seen over the course of the last 15 years or so is monetary policy moving to ever more extreme levels. That we go back and as we've gone from the Volcker era of type money, we've seen steadily lowering rates and steadily more extreme policy responses from central banks to each crisis that's come along, or whether you call that the Fed put, or whether you call it currency wars, or whatever you want to name, monetary policy responses have become more extreme. Think back to 2003, 2004. And the astonishment that everybody had when the Fed funds rate was cut down to 1%, and we talked about the fact that this was the lowest it had been since Elvis was recording. I'm good on pop culture quotes, by the way.
But
that brings it home in a special way.
Absolutely, I thought it would. That's nothing compared to where we went in 2009 and 2010, when we brought in quantitative easing. Think about the extremes that Japan went to. When we went to 2012 and the extraordinary QE program they brought in to revive domestic markets and to bring the yen down. And then think about the fact that since, Sweden aside, since summer of 2014, the fact that we have moved to a situation whereby 4 out of 8 G8 members have got a negative deposit rate. And we talk about it as though it is the norm. Then think about the fact that every single ECB meeting, Mr. Draghi is now asked the question about helicopter money. So we're not even talking about quantitative easing anymore. We're talking about QE, where the central bank's never going to buy the assets back or sell the assets back, or he's not going to do any other version of that astonishing stuff. And I think the fact of the matter is that if you look at what it's meant for the real world and things that actually have a real impact on foreign policy, and by this I particularly mean food and energy prices, the moves have become ever more extreme. Think about the rallying oil prices between 2002 and 2008, $149 a barrel we got to, with the majority of that move coming after Ben Bernanke started cutting rates in the summer of 2007 because he was worried about a crisis, not because of real demand. Think about the summer of 2010. This, to me, is actually one of the most astonishing things I've ever seen in terms of an untoward foreign policy impact. There was a terrible non-farm payrolls number at the start of June 2010, and everybody in the financial markets recognised that another round of quantitative easing was coming from the Federal Reserve. There was also a drought taking place that summer, and so food and energy prices soared during the second half of that year. What happened in January 2011? Some poor soul in Tunisia who could not afford their petrol to get him to work or feed his family immolated himself. Matter of days later, a similar revolution kicks off in Egypt and then spreads all the way through the Middle East. Would we have had the Arab Spring if it hadn't been for the astonishing rise in food and energy prices? So remember, all those regimes have been steady for 20 or 30 years. And so the only thing that changed was actually what happened to the cost of food and energy. And then think about the course of the last few months. Well, let's say from the summer of 2014. Would Russia have found itself in the extreme position it was where it had to finally allow its currency to free float if it hadn't been for a collapse in oil prices? And would that collapse not have happened if you hadn't had the astonishing inflows to the dollar that took place on the back of A, the tapering of purchases of assets by the Fed and the promise of a rate hike, and B, the fact that actually negative deposit rates in Europe were forcing more and more money into the dollar? The answer is probably not. So there is no question to my mind that the interlinkages between monetary policy and foreign policy implications is there and becoming more extreme. But there's some odd bits. And there's two bits I want to throw into the debate because I think they're absolutely fascinating. The first is that in some ways monetary policy settings are now moving to such extreme levels that, from the trading community at least, is starting to drown out geopolitical issues. I'll give you a few simple examples. If you look over the course of the last 18 months or so, you'll see that the most volatile days in the foreign exchange markets, without exception, have come on the back of monetary policy shifts or currency policy moves. Obviously, one of the largest came on the back of the China currency concerns last August, where the market misinterpreted what China was doing. But look at what happens when Mr. Draghi disappoints by only cutting by 10 basis points to a mere minus 40 basis points, and the euro soars by 4%. Compare that to the market's utter lack of reaction to the events when Turkey shoots down two Russian jets. First time a NATO member has done that since the mid-1950s. Think about the lack of reaction to the heightened tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia in January of this year. Or at a more tragic level, think about the lack of reaction to what happened in Paris and Brussels. That's a market where monetary policy is drowning out everything else. The second thing I want to highlight is this. I think one of the really interesting shifts in terms of monetary policy over the course of the last 12 months is that we've got a Federal Reserve that is suddenly far more sensitive to international issues than it ever has been, at least in public. I give you the fact that they failed to hike rates last September, and it was made quite explicit that that was actually on the back of concerns about international markets and China quite specifically. Then look at the change in tone in the Fed in January of this year, when in the face of a strong dollar, we had weak oil prices and concerns about China's currency policy and the drain of foreign exchange reserves. The Fed stepped back, and it's hard to see that not in light of actually trying to defend international markets. Maybe out of enlightened self-interest, but still, that's a very different mandate to anything we've seen before. Janet Yellen mentioned it again back in March when she talked quite explicitly about concerns about markets. We've gone from a world where the Fed was going to hike 4 times this year to 2 if we're lucky. And it's hard not to see that as a response to international matters rather than purely a domestic mandate. And I think that is the fascinating bit about how monetary policy and currency policy issues, at least, are starting to interact.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. That's almost as frightening as Brexit, I must say. So, over to David, who no doubt will take a rather different angle on this, seen from a sort of education perspective.
Well, thank you, Chairman. First of all, I know some of you will be very disappointed to hear, and many of you are relieved, I'm not an economist. I'm not a banker, and therefore I'm coming to it from a more practical point of view. And whatever I say this evening will be based really on the practicalities. However, I have been in business, big and small, private, public, in the UK, overseas, from America, China, Africa, and so on. So I've had quite a lot of experience at the sort of butt of these policies that go around that Sir Paul set out very clearly, and I must say I was very impressed by his lecture. I can't say I understood it all, but I was very impressed by it, and I thought it was very interesting to hear. Where I connected quite a bit was when he was talking about the mercantile aspects of it, because we've been a mercantile nation for centuries and centuries, from beads to bitcoins, from the Hanseatic League to EU, if you like. So we've had a lot of experience, and all these things do affect the way that we work, and of course the policies, the economic policies, the political policies do affect. I know, talking about currency exchanges, when I was running businesses in the UK and America, the way the fluctuation between the pound and the dollar, and particularly in the 80s, made it extraordinarily difficult to get a balance there. And in other places, China has been mentioned quite a bit. And I think one of my very big experiences in life was going back to 1989. If you remember, Tiananmen Square happened when the tanks were sent in to clear the uprising in Tiananmen Square. And that created a huge reaction. I'd been in and out of China doing business for a few years before that, during the 80s. And it was interesting to see what happened, because America and the EU all immediately reacted against it. They imposed sanctions. The EU got all the European countries together. There was an agreement they wouldn't do business. I think it was signed in Madrid. And that was quite significant. But what happened? Well, shortly afterwards, France went in and Germany went in. And the UK woke up and said, well, we ought to do something about this, because China is a big country. It's getting bigger all the time. So we need the business there. And indeed, what they did was they asked Eric Sharp, who was the chairman of Cable & Wireless, a very successful company in Hong Kong, and also the president of the Sino-British Trade Council, which I happen to be a member of the Executive Council. So they asked him to go and meet the Chinese government. Now, that's a businessman, not a politician. He's a businessman. I was asked to go along as well, and I did, and we met with Li Peng, the premier at the time, and basically said, well, naughty boy, but really we want to carry on doing business with you. So there was an occasion where policy and the economics came together, collided to a degree, but sparked off. And in a way, I think it changed to a degree the West view. I think it had a great impact on China, because China started to look at things a little bit different. And so eventually we did carry on doing business in China. And look where China is now. And I think in many ways, I was struck by Sir Paul's scenarios, his 4 scenarios. And I do wonder if the West has lost the opportunity, or did lose the opportunity, to bring China more in along with the dollar as the reserve currency. Now, I don't know how that would work, but I think we didn't quite bring China in sufficiently into the West. And America largely was responsible for that. And now China is all over Africa, as was mentioned. I mean, I've been in and out of many countries in Africa, and it is just amazing to see. Their foreign policy is, we want what you've got in Africa, and we'll pay for it. Now, there is a bringing together of foreign policy and economic policy as well. So, I think from what Sir Paul was saying and the question that's been asked, yes, it is important for these things to come together, at least some of the time, and probably most of the time, but how it's done, to me, has to be done in a very pragmatic way, because it's the people, like many of you in the room, who have businesses overseas, internationally, who have to deal with these policies, both foreign policies and economic policies. And we have to make it work, because at the end of the day, we have to bring the money home, and we have to earn the keep for the UK.
David, thank you very much indeed. What we've had is a very, very interesting setting out of some of the linkages, some of the divergences between monetary policy and the global and global geopolicy, if you like. And we've begun to start talking about a bit of an agenda as well, particularly in relation to countries like China. And we'll try and explore that over the next 3/4 of an hour. But what I first want to do is to perhaps explore a little bit about the past before we go on to the future. And I've got a question here, I think from Claire Brooks. If Claire, you're in the audience, it's either Claire or Robin Booth, I think, who will have a particular question. You've drawn the short straw. And what we'll do is we'll explore that, and then and also take other questions on that, and then we've got another salient which we'll explore.
Well, thank you, Lord Tim, for giving us permission to be confused. I felt in the lecture a little bit like the accused judge addressed by F.E. Smith when I was asked, was any of the wiser? The answer to that was no, and I was scarcely better informed. Thank you. And listening to this debate here, I would echo David's words. There's a detachment between the world I know. I run an early stage emerging technology business, not internet stuff, real things. And all of this leaves me slightly gasping as to what I actually do with these policies. And there are two words up there which I think are very important. One is trade, world traders, and the other one is commercial, in Commercial Education Trust. And I've got a question that's linked to that is, do you actually think that the world policymakers, be they from the world of economics or from the world of finance, do you think they actually understand the fundamental rudiments of those two words? And is there anything we might do to help them through commercial education to have a better understanding?
So, who's in the hot seat? Should we start with Simon?
Okay. I think one argument over the course of the last 15 years is actually politicians, if you believe there is a link between politics and monetary and currency policy, I think it's a fairly good argument that there is. They have been all too well aware of the commercial considerations, because there is a pretty good argument that says that most of the world's major central banks have been involved in a war to try and get the most competitively priced currency of all. The problem is it's something of a zero-sum game. If you look, there is a pretty decent argument that what the US did from 2001 onwards was follow a policy, let's call it benign neglect towards the dollar. What is absolutely true is that they ran monetary policy in a lot easier settings than they had done over the previous 5 or 6 years. The dollar went down. And actually, they did rather well out of it. They got a currency that was 30% cheaper. They managed to do it at a time without any major inflationary pressures, because, of course, the folks that were pegging their currency to the dollar, or trying to, such as China, ended up taking those inflationary pressures off them, and they're able to borrow money at ever cheaper rates over that period of time. And so actually, you could look at what the US did and say, actually, they were a massive winner to having an entirely mercantilist attitude towards their currency, and China, unfortunately, ended up as a fairly massive loser, as it ended up with a currency that was significantly stronger than it had been, intermittent bursts of high inflation in the run-up to the financial crisis, $4 trillion worth of debt that wasn't necessarily earning that much. And then in the latter stages, as they became overloaded with infrastructure, an economy that was struggling significantly. So from that perspective, you could argue they were too focused on trade.
Thank you. Vicky.
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I would say that both the economists, I'm one, and the people who put foreign policy together, who I do believe actually work quite close together, can get things terribly, terribly wrong. And perhaps they're not always, whatever they do, they don't understand the unintended consequences of what they're doing. But you have to bear in mind that, first of all, they set those policies in the context of what government policies are in individual countries, because unfortunately it is a very global environment. So if you have huge imbalances, like for example, on the trade side, for example, Germany has refused to encourage domestic economy, so you can't really sell an awful lot to them, even if you want to. You say you probably do, but overall, I mean, they have a huge surplus, which they have been completely reluctant to do anything about. So you have these huge imbalances around. And of course, they benefit from a very weak euro, with very low interest rates, but also because of the problems of all the periphery countries. So, and if you have that, wherever you may be, if you're in the US or if you're an IMF official, and you can't actually get them to move, or a European Commission person, and you are supposed to be imposing excessive deficit procedure, which also are meant to work the other way. In other words, if you're overdoing it, you have too much of a surplus, you've got to do something about it and balancing out, but they don't do it. So those things frame, in a way, or limit what you can actually do on the economic side if you're trying to set world policy or trying to set interest rates. But at the same time, there is a big issue because of all this international environment, and because of what's happening in the financial sector, and because we decided to regulate hugely after the financial crisis, there isn't enough lending going on. I mean, quantitative easing we could complain about, but at least it has finally encouraged more lending in Europe, even though it's now slowing down again. It did for a few months. But the real problem is because it has been a financial crisis and a credit supply crisis. World trade, as I'm sure you know, has simply not been growing. And I asked that question of Paul Tucker at the Tacitus Lecture. World trade, instead of leading world growth, despite all the efforts of the policymakers, they don't quite understand what the impact would be, is lagging it. And if world trade isn't recovering, and if all the banks are just lending nationally, which is what's happened, it's been very protectionist what's been going on actually recently, rather than global. You end up with a situation where the person who's trying to export finds it actually quite difficult, or even import, because of all these problems that still exist. And you have places like Greece with capital controls. And the interesting thing is that in the paper, and also what Paul said, is that actually perhaps it would be easier to be able to control what's happening internationally if you had some capital controls. So you knew what was happening, and you wouldn't be affected by all these movements of money, which actually very often mean you can't plan anything from the center at all. So the IMF has got it wrong again and again and again. Over-optimistic scenarios of where we would be in terms of growth and trade. That's not helpful for any of the people who are trying to do business right now, if indeed the financial system isn't supporting them. And I think we ended up in a bit of schizophrenic situation where suddenly we think the response to the financial sector crisis was fine and everything should be, moving up. In fact, finding that actually in practice and on the ground, it's not happening. So your question is absolutely right. I think neither the economic thinkers or the political ones and foreign ones have got it right at all, because they have not been able to forecast what the impact of their policies was going to be.
So let me shift the focus slightly, Brigid. What chance do the rest of us have of understanding what's going on, given that actually, as Vicky says, the two camps don't really understand each other in that sense. I mean, we have to make sense of this in our everyday lives, especially if we're not bankers or monetary policy experts.
Well, you shouldn't trust an expert for a start, should you? And I suppose, and that's actually one of the points that I wanted to make. So the sorts of models that are used by economists and indeed monetary policy people, they're not dissimilar. The the commercial and the foreign policy people actually have a different mindset. And one of the risks in the way that the financial and economic policy people think, and this is very much germane to your question, is they think people react quickly. They think that we're all capable of doing what Kahneman calls thinking slow, fast. And of course, we're not. Moreover, in businesses, it takes time to build a market. It takes time to build a position. It takes time to get a brand. It's easy to lose it very often, but it's jolly hard to build it in the first place. So the sort of reactions to, say, exchange rate changes or interest rate changes, which the models say should happen quite quickly because people will immediately see what this means, does happen fast in some markets, in the monetary policy markets, in the financial markets, but it does not happen quickly in trade markets. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but that is not well understood. So they don't get it. They don't actually it's not part of the mindset. So anything that any of us can do, and that maybe the CT can do, commercial...
I'm relying on David for the total solution here,
exactly.
I tell you.
Well, we've been trying for a couple of 100 years and not done very well yet, so, it might be a bit of a slow haul, but it seems to me that is one of the key things, to try and get people who make policy in markets that move very fast, or believe in rational economic man who can make calculations very fast, to get them to understand that most of the rest of the world isn't working like that. And that's certainly true in, say, in the foreign policy world, where you will get lots of long, slow discussion and slow tectonic plate movements, which can undermine. That's one of the reasons why you get those unintended consequences. So the reaction times are different in different markets, and that means that the theory and the practice don't get very well aligned. I think it also means that actually sometimes trying to look for the immediate solution, trying to look for the answer, the policy answer, is misguided. There has to be a certain amount of time passing. There has to be a certain amount of learning what other people's interests are and being willing to listen to that before you can come up with a practical solution. You talk about the practical bit. The practical bit, as I'm sure you discovered working in international businesses and so on, the mindset can be very different. I got involved with even a French-British merger once. It fell apart. Their cultures were so different, and they couldn't explain themselves to each other, and the whole thing just kind of it was dissolved, I think, I think the company went under, probably under the stress of all of this. Yet they did very similar things in very similar ways.
I think a good lunch is the answer, actually.
It could have been, yeah. But the French idea of a good lunch and the British idea of a good lunch was not the same.
That's true.
It was not the same. It didn't last the same amount of time, and didn't have the same number of courses, and they couldn't get their act together. So being willing to listen is the bedrock of successful policy making, and models are not.
So, David, how are we going to sort this all out?
Well, I'm not sure, but you started off by saying learning from history, and I'm always encouraged by my old school motto, which was Respici Prospici. So, looking back and learning from the past and trying to help solve the problems of the future, I think is actually quite a good way. So Paul talked about Bretton Woods, and in a way that has set the whole political and economic agenda for Europe over these past half century or so. And you look back and it's more clear, you can see the way things were going. But today, I'm not so sure things are so transparent. I'm talking about Europe here. Jean Monnet had a clear view, but I'm not sure we had a clear view. I'm not sure that the way that the European Union has developed has been as transparent as it might have been, and perhaps have been more transparent, it might have helped all round. The UK, to a degree, I think, over that period of time, particularly because of the American influence, who wanted to suppress the colonial aspect of things, has lost out a bit in its international trade, and that's unfortunate. And I think, in many ways, we ought to regain that. In or out of Europe, we ought to regain it, because we've had it in the past, we can do it in the future, and I don't see why we shouldn't, one way or the other, in or out. The other thing that really amazes me, and it's a small point, maybe, is foreign aid. used to be a thing called aid and trade, where you go out, you do business, you could get some aid, in return for that you got some trade from the country. The Americans, through US aid, still seems to keep that going. The French do it all the time, of course. We've somehow given it up. Why? Why are we doing that? I don't understand that, I have to say. So why that foreign policy is there, why that is in place, I don't know, because I think there's a lot to be said for proper aid, not handouts, proper aid. After all, the old adage that it's much better to teach somebody to teach how to fish rather than to give them the fish itself is very, very true. And unfortunately, we don't always do that. We have a tendency to hand out the fish and think we've done a good job.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to come to our next sort of main question, and then I'm going to throw it open after that. But I think Dominic Broom has got a question. Dominic?
Indeed. Well, I think it's a question that I might put to the panel other than...
Do you want to wait for the...
Sorry. Sorry, I think it's indeed a question I might put to the panel other than Simon, because I think he's sort of already revealed his hand somewhat on this one, Tim. Does the panel...
You've had too much doom and disaster, haven't you, Dominic?
There's never too much doom and disaster.
So based on what we've been discussing, do the rest of the panel agree with the assumption that the world has been involved in currency wars over the past 15 years? And if so, what's the sort of empirical evidence for that?
And I might add a rider to that. Do you think that the next 10 to 15 years we're going to be engaged in similar fashion? Brigid?
I'm just wondering about what I mean by a war, I suppose. So that's why I'm kind of hesitating. I think currencies are in continuous battle. So in a way, that's the skirmish, the positioning, the desire to have a strong currency. Everybody wants to export, after all. Nobody wants an import. And yet, of course, that's impossible. Somebody's export's got to be somebody else's import, and balance of payments are balance sheet activities, and they have to balance. So that is a continuous piece of manipulation, if you like, and seen rather dramatically in the creation of the euro, not in a currency war devaluation, but actually a currency manipulation to try and get yourself into a place where you could have a strong currency. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that everybody always wants to devalue. Far from it. Most economies, most of the time, actually want to have a strong currency so that they are seen to be a good place to invest, and that there's almost a kind of a pride about that as well. So I think that I think that the evidence. So you also asked about the evidence. So I suppose I'm saying that these continuous skirmishes means that there are always these pieces of battle going on. But I would say, actually, I suppose really, if I think back to the 70s and the 80s, if this is a currency war, it's a much quieter one than the ones that we experienced in the period where every month balance of payments was in the news, where exchange rates were absolutely were always in the newspapers. One of the things that I think is quite remarkable over the last 20 years, in fact, is how little attention people now pay to exchange rates compared to what they used to do. So I think it's a series of small skirmishes, not many people killed.
Prospectively?
Prospectively, I think a lot will depend on the euro and whether it falls apart or not. And to be honest, I really don't know the answer to that. And well, if anybody does, they're probably not going to tell us, are they? Because they'll be out there doing something in the markets to try and make sure they can benefit from it.
Well, if you don't, Brigid, the rest of us are very foggy.
I think that euro is very vulnerable because the internal tensions, which would obviously be worsened by a Brexit vote, which I don't think that will happen, but I think even so, the backwash from all of this leaves the euro very vulnerable as a currency of any description. So I think it will struggle and possibly it won't collapse exactly because it can't. I mean, the cost of getting out of it. I'm involved with the bank in Ireland, and when in 2011 we looked at, oh dear, what happens? And we decided there was no point one worrying about that because you would still end up with that currency. What would happen, of course, though, is the capital controls. It's the only thing that you can do under those circumstances. So that's not so much a currency war as a autarky problem.
Right. Well, if we have time, we'll come back to that. That would be very interesting. Vicky?
I agree. I agree, but I think capital controls would be terrible.
You're not allowed to agree on this panel.
I have to agree.
We're trying to stimulate debate.
Occasionally we will agree.
Change of view now.
I mean, economists do tend to, sensible ones tend to agree, of course. But lots of currencies have been pegged for quite some time. And let's just remember also about the Chinese currency. We've all been expecting it to move up because, of course, it was pegged at a level where it was rather competitive, and actually now it's come down. I mean, if anything, instead of going up by the manipulation that the Chinese have done. But actually, it's pretty mild in terms of the impact it has had. I think we need to be much more worried about other things, such as dumping of products, which has really been a big issue for our industries. But also the war that's going on, which isn't a currency war, although it's sort of semi-related, between Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, and the US in terms of shell oil.
Yes.
And I think that is quite important because that's where economics is used to destroy another sector, if possible, and to increase again the position of one country over another. And those areas are very dangerous because A, they're unpredictable in terms of how long will they carry on doing it and are they really doing it for that reason, and B, they have huge repercussions. I mean, actually it's been good for the rest of us because oil prices have been low, of course, much lower than we had expected. Very bad for loads of sectors of the economy, of course. I had to stop investing and all that sort of stuff. But overall good for the advanced economies. But it's interesting, we are almost sort of voyeurs in this because we have no way in which we can control what Saudi does or what the US does.
It's very interesting. I mean, what you're almost positing is a sort of series of tools for instability, really. I mean, oil, trade dumping, currency manipulation.
Well, we see, I personally think that capital controls are going to make things worse because the balance of payments issues are going to come back to haunt you because the reason why you can cover them, you don't worry, is because money moves. Yep. And I think that's going back to what Brigid was saying earlier, the previous question about how the markets react. I mean, short-term money movement it's instantaneous. And of course, it's destabilizing in one way, and maybe we want to stop some of that perhaps, but I can't quite see how we can do this without seriously affecting the workings of the global economy.
David, do you want to come in?
How do we stop hot money without stopping warm money? That's yeah. How would you know what the difference is?
Well, we'll come back to Simon for a total answer on that one in 1 minute. David, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm glad Vicky raised about Saudi because I don't know whether there's a currency war on or not. I just know how the currencies move and have suffered or very occasionally gained from it. But I was also going to raise the point that Vicky's raised that other countries use other things like oil to manipulate, if you like, the way things are going, and that seems quite serious as well. Okay, we have benefited in lower oil prices, but I'm sure things can go the other way as well. And Saudi certainly as a country is getting very worried. I've been in and out of Saudi a few times, and it's getting very worried about its internal situation. It doesn't want an Arab Spring there, so it needs to create jobs. One of the reasons why it's selling off, I think, some of the Aramco holdings to diversify into other things to provide jobs, because frankly a lot of people don't have jobs, real jobs in Saudi. But yes, the currency wars, I mean, I was always amused once I was in Dubai and I went to change some money in my favourite currency place, and I was standing there looking at it, and it had the UAE currency against the pound sterling and against the Scottish pound. This is about 4 or 5 years ago when that was going on. And there was a difference. There was a big difference. Absolutely. I couldn't believe it. I took a photograph of it thinking this is amazing. So yes, currency wars maybe.
The arbitrage between the two.
Yeah.
Actually, that was quite well tweeted, strangely enough.
Yes.
Simon, warm money versus hot money, capital controls, etc.
Okay, so the reason I would suggest that hot money has become quite so prevalent is because it was quite so easy for hot money to leverage up. And frankly, that probably really was a function of ultra easy interest rates. When did the carry trade start? Well, that really starts in the mid-1990s, when Japan starts to push money down, push interest rates down aggressively, and the yen becomes this funding vehicle for people to be able to push money around. When did the carry trade really start to build? From 2002 onwards, as the US and Japan both pursue ultra-easy monetary policy. So actually, if you want to move from a world that's not driven by hot money, you have to start moving back to tighter money. So that's the first simple point. We're in a world that's awash with leverage. Yeah. And there's where the key issue, I think, lies. As far as capital controls are concerned, I completely agree. I think it's a nightmare, it's a bad idea. The terrible thing is, guess what? We've tried it twice already within Europe, within the Eurozone, in the course of the last 3 years. And to come back to Brigid's point about the euro, if we really want to talk about the extremities that we're at, the fact that we've had to do that in Cyprus and in Greece, had to go for capital control, something that was never supposed to happen, within this single currency, I think it tells you exactly about how fragile it is. And just to, I know we're going to talk about it later, but for me, you go back to July of last year when the German Finance Ministry sent that note out suggesting that Greece should take a temporary exit from Europe. You know, that's roughly like Sterling's temporary exit from the ERM in 1992. That's scary because that actually says it's not even a single currency.
Simon, thank you. Right, I am going to throw it open to the audience for questions or observations. Yes, gentleman at the front.
Just listening to the debate and the comments you're making now, and I'm just sitting here thinking, David, from a trade perspective, you say, you know, building a trade, you know, rebuilding trade, whether in or out of Europe, that's great, but you've got to be able to manufacture the things in the first place. And if you're not manufacturing, what are you trading? So that's one aspect. You look at capital from a financial institution's perspective and all the rules and regulations coming out from the regulators in terms of you know, Basel III and everything else. How much of this is being driven by, and I'm going to use a fairly controversial term here, political illiteracy of our politicians about commercial and financial aspects? And a lot of this is driven by politicians wanting to please their voters and being completely illiterate about the unintended consequences of what they're doing. And until we get to grips with politicians saying, look, if you don't understand this, be quiet and leave it to those who do, you know, at what point do you where does this stop? Because at the moment, everything you see is still driven by politicians who are either wanting to bash the banks, it's all the banks' fault, yet actually the politicians have actually set the climate and the rules for all of this to happen in the first place. And I'd be interested to see what each of the panel have to say about that.
Good question. So illiteracy or actually deliberate ignorance, perhaps. Who knows? David,
well, okay, sorry, let's just add to that. If you go back many years ago, politicians at the time either had good commercial backgrounds before they went into politics or real world, and too many of them had come out of a university having studied politics, worked in a think tank for a politician, and have actually not done anything in the real world.
Well, I would comment on that as well. But first of all, going back to what we can export. Okay, the manufacturing base in this country is very similar to actually France or actually America. It's about 12% or something like that of the economy. But potentially, well, we are already big in professional services, in banking and all that sort of stuff. And really, that is a great thing to do. My business has been in consultancy, which is really providing intellectual power to projects, in my case, in the transport and infrastructure business, but it goes right across the way. This is a very a good business to be in, potentially very lucrative if we can get ourselves into these countries to do it. And certainly, my experience in the past has been that if you have a consultant in advising a country on a project, then the manufacturing can follow. The problem sometimes has been that our manufacturing has not actually kept up pace. And this has been particularly the case in the transport industry. We were out advising all around the world in transport. And yet what was happening in the UK, Metro Camel went out of business. A lot of companies who could have followed through went out of business. And then were bought over by Alstom or Siemens or Bombardier. So although some of the jobs were kept in this country, the big business went elsewhere. So that wasn't very good. And politicians don't always listen. I've been in and out of Whitehall in my time trying to tell politicians what we need to do in order to get business in other countries, and they don't always listen or they don't understand. I'm never sure.
Well, Vicky, this is a question a bit made for you. You were the chief economist at the DTI. Politicians, should they are they guilty as charged?
Look, the truth is, if you're trying to trade internationally, that there are indeed, it's much easier to trade manufacturing goods because, of course, the WTO rules, the World Trade Organization rules, as I'm sure you all know, have reduced tariffs quite significantly. But of course, very little has happened in services. So if you're not in manufacturing, then you're in difficulty. I mean, you may need to do things through agents you have over there, and then there are all the problems of entering the market, corruption, etc., etc.
Sure.
And of course, the markets are a long distance away. We don't even have a single market for services in Europe, let alone what happens elsewhere. So I can understand your difficulty. The second thing is, I made exactly the point you made, that banks have been constrained. There's a bit of schizophrenia there, constrained by tighter requirements, and of course that is stopping across Europe quite a lot of the lending that could have happened otherwise. But of course you still have banks, unfortunately, in serious difficulty. So we're still reacting to the previous crisis, but in reality, because there's been such a slowdown in the economy, in a way also engineered by huge constraining of demand that has taken place afterwards, so quite a lot of austerity policies, it has meant that lots of companies are in greater difficulty now than they were before. So loads of non-performing loans all across Europe, which of course hit us as well. And you have the situation where Deutsche Bank now makes huge losses. So the one global bank in Germany, and of course we've seen others close in Germany. We've seen the Italian banking sector right now needing an extra fund. It managed to escape getting a bailout before, but it's now getting money. Or putting money there if it gets the state aid rules agreed. So there's a lot of underlying problems, which basically means that they can't lend, even if they wanted to, but also because they're constrained increasingly. Now, these are the politicians. Certainly, we've seen quite a lot of stuff here in the UK done for, which looks like the politicians saying having an anti-bank attitude. But in reality, in my view, the central bankers have been quite complicit in this. I mean, we are the one country that still insists on separating investment and retail banking, whereas the rest of Europe doesn't seem to be concerned. So there was a bit of an obsession in that area. But actually, a lot of the Basel III stuff, and of course there's also the problem of Solvency II and what have you, it comes from the BIS. There it's not politicians, it is maybe the ex-politicians, but they're functionaries, they're the people who are there to ensure the stability of the system. So I think they're under less influence from that point of view, but I'm sure they will be up to a point influenced by the change in the mood and the expectations of them to really be tough, so that the things we saw before don't happen again, when we know that it was a political decision by the US to extend mortgages to people who simply couldn't afford it for political reasons, which ended up being taken up by the banks and resulted in what we resulted in. So that's my view.
I think... Do politicians understand business? No. So let's get that one out of the way. Is the way that some of these policies are made deliberately illiterate? I don't think they are. I think they just come from different sorts of places in the spectrum, so that it's entirely possible, on the one hand, to have politicians say, you must lend more to small business, and regulators saying, you must invest in less risky assets. And these two things are indeed in conflict. One of the things that I think has contributed to that is this general response to the crisis, which has meant that retail banks have, it's very odd. They've become mortgage banks, residential mortgages. So they're building societies by another kind of name. They want to take in long-term deposits, or at least sticky deposits, and indeed they are regulated to have a net stable funding ratio, which is a measure, apparently, of the sticky assets that you've got, the sticky liabilities, and put it into safe assets. And the safest asset in most regulators' minds is a residential mortgage. So what are you? So you're certainly not a bank in the 19th century sense, or even mid-20th century, which did not do any of that kind of business. and saw their liabilities as being turned into trading assets and investing in working capital. And I'm sure most people in this room don't need to be told how hard it is to get working capital these days. So I think it's much more than just politicians. It's been going on for 50 years, actually, this sort of change in attitude on, if you like, ordinary banks, at any rate. Not investment banking and prop trading is a different story altogether. So I think it's you get the politicians you deserve. You create this environment in which that is the way that banking and trading works, and then you get politicians who don't understand that it could be done any other way. So I think that's, for me, it's our fault as much as the politicians' fault.
Well, do you agree with that, Simon?
Well, yes, very much so. I mean, the question really was, have we got illiterate politicians when it comes to making choices, and do we need to have businessmen, people from the real world, coming along and actually setting policy? And of course, we're all going to say yes, that makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, it also makes Donald Trump the perfect candidate for the US presidential election.
He may turn out to be a much better president than you expect.
Yeah.
And actually, between Trump and Clinton...
But
what's that expression about you don't want to get what you wish for,
Yeah. I mean, I think for me the interesting part about this is the rise of populist politics in the post-2008 world. And the fact that we're actually, not just in the US, it is just as true within Europe, that we've seen this rise. Now, whether those are the politicians we deserve them, I really don't know. But it's fascinating that shift has taken place. And actually, as far as Trump's concerned, when it comes to his thoughts about the Fed, I'm not quite certain whether audit the Fed is really the way I'd want to go, and I'm not quite certain that his ideas about calling China a currency manipulator quite explicitly would be the best way forward, and I'm definitely not certain saying that Japan would be as well is the great idea. And when he vaguely mentioned the idea of a return to a gold standard, that just made my blood freeze.
What we need is a few more politicians here who've gone bankrupt, I suppose, don't we, really? And then they've had real experience of the outside world, of the business world, exactly.
Can I just add a point?
Yes, David.
Just as a point that Vicky raised about it's easier to export manufactured goods than it is services. This is absolutely true. And one of the reasons is, of course, the rise in regulation. Because it's much easier to define products than it is to the services. You can sell a shoe much easier than the service and how to design the shoe. Here's a box of shoes. That's so much. They're all defined. It's all there. The designing is something which is much more difficult to define. And that's one of the reasons why. And the upsurge of regulation in the EU as well is probably one of the reasons why the transfer of services has not happened as much as the transfer of goods and the freedom of people. We have not been able to sell services just as much as we should do.
The trouble is, services is what nowadays we are much better at.
Absolutely.
And we have been exporting, but even, say, a company like Rolls-Royce,
yes,
in any given engine sale that it does, the value of the services which are associated with that in terms of maintenance and software management and all of those things is much greater than the value of the actual piece of machinery, and is a continuing contract.
Yeah.
So in fact, there's an awful lot of services now, particularly in sort of technology businesses that you were talking about. There's much more services integrated into that than perhaps we think.
Now, we're coming close to the end of what has been a fascinating debate, but I would just like somebody who may have a burning question at the back. I can see a lady at the back, burning question, and then I'm going to ask the panel for a 2-sentence roundup, partly answering the question, but partly adding anything that they wish to add, particularly if they've disagreed with anything that the other panellists have said, because I think ending on a note of controversy is absolutely crucial.
Oh dear.
Yes, I was interested in your earlier assumption that the UK should be making more benefit from the aid for trade agenda. And I was just wondering, where in the world and in what projects does the panel think we should actually be giving more aid to in order to benefit the UK economy? And also, do you actually think aid for trade is really aid, or is it actually an investment?
Great, thank you. That's a good round-up question. I'm going to start with Simon this time.
Oh, I thought you would, because I don't have a strong answer to that. Is it investment? Yes, absolutely, it's investment. So I think that was always traditionally the idea, as far as I understood it, and it was to the mutual benefit of everybody. As to where it should be, that's a rather harder question. Should we genuinely be trying to compete with China in places like Africa? I really don't know. Maybe that's one for David to answer.
Right, passing the buck, I see there.
Very rapidly.
Right, very good, thank you.
I don't think we should do aid, or at least we certainly shouldn't call it aid. If we called it, we are going to invest in countries to help them develop, then I'm kind of happy about that, so long as you've got a project which is as well designed as we would hopefully do for a project in this country as well. Too much aid is just builds corruption. Does anybody know about the groundnut scandal in Ghana? Yeah, we were going to be so clever, help the Ghanaians, we were going to help them grow groundnuts, spent millions, impoverished the Ghanaians, and of course the soil wasn't suitable in the first place. So be very careful where you undermine traditional practices, and these should be bottom-up programs where there's a payback from the investment, which you can then say, okay, there's that payback, that's the gain from trade, the gain from this project, and I'm going to give it to you, but you shouldn't do the project on that basis.
Great, well I can see the debate could run and run on that score. That's great. Vicky.
Well, obviously I think I've been very involved in work in the developing world, paid for by the ODA as was, and then DFID, and of course USAID and so on. And the projects that work really well, the aid projects, are technical assistance and encouraging private sector participation in various areas and making sure the sort of things that Brigid just mentioned do not happen because you're on the ground and you do the right things. But you do have loads and loads of people who are very socially minded who work for these aid agencies, and when they see all these economists moving into there and saying, we want a result of this, we want to really see sort of growth and sort of investment, if you like, coming, they consider us, at least they used to, with great suspicion, because they're much more interested in the social aspect, humanitarian. And I think that we mustn't forget that it is very important in so many areas where what the various agencies have done have helped very significantly. But better oversight and making sure that they are proper projects is really what you need to do, rather than necessarily cutting them. And are we allowed to disagree with each other now, or is it later?
No, you've just disagreed. I think we're ending on a very high note, if I may say so.
Oh, fine.
Absolutely investment, I agree. It is investment, and investment is important. And I also agree with Brigid. To a degree, I'm not sure aid in a very, I don't know, but investment, yes. An investment in technical services that help projects are very good and can lead to good business. And I'm going to give you an example of where I was involved. About 20 years ago, we were looking at the design of the Cairo Metro. The bid was round about 7 million at that time for the design of it. This is the design of it. It came down to shortlist between the Paris the Metro people and ourselves. We went to government because the Egyptians were asking for a contribution to this. They wanted some money, in other words, from the government. Around about 500,000, within 7 million wasn't a big deal. Our government said no. The French government said yes, handed out Légion d'honneurs for services about to be rendered. The French got the design, and the French got all the construction for billions and billions of dollars after that. That was something we lost out on because we didn't see that it was an investment, not aid or not something else. It was an investment. We lost out. And that has happened time and time again in my experience and my industry around the world. Now, if we're world traders, we need some help from the government, but that's where we should put our money.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you for that question. That's given us something very useful to argue over having a drink in a few minutes' time. But before we go and have a drink, I'm going to ask Wendy, our master, to close the proceedings.
Well, thank you very much. I won't keep you for long from your drinks, but I obviously do just have to say a few thank yous. And thank you very much to all the panel. I think we've had some hugely interesting ideas discussed. And I'm sure we've all got a lot to take away to think about. Also, thank you very much to Tim for chairing it so expertly and finishing it absolutely bang on time. to our sponsors, whose support of this event has meant that it has been free to all who have attended, and they are BNY Mellon, Commercial Education Trust, and Price Bailey. I would also like to thank Tim and DLA Piper for letting us use these magnificent conference facilities free of charge. DLA Piper's staff have been very supportive, particularly Tim's secretary, Simone Davis, who has been hugely patient with all... yes, I don't think... Is she here? Probably not. But she has been absolutely fantastic in her support for this event, hugely patient with all the world traders' varying demands. So we'll say a huge thank you to her in person outside. We've also had our own Tacitus committee, and there are a number of people from the world traders who've done a lot of work on this project and working with our sponsors to see that everybody has what they want out of the evening. I won't go through lists of names, but thank you very much. You know who you are. And also to Margot Mert, who's organised this event for us. It's her first time dealing with an event for the world traders, and I think she's done a tremendous job. Well, we hope you think that it's all gone well too. You'll find in your packs a form like that, which enables you to give feedback through SurveyMonkey. There's also the email address for those who don't use apps. We would enormously appreciate your feedback. It will help us to design future events that meet people's interests and expectations. The other thing we would say is that there is the opportunity for all the guests to win a bottle of champagne. If you'd like to leave your business card in the bowl, which you'll find outside the drawer, we'll draw it during the reception so that you can win a bottle of champagne.
That's reasonable, Margaret.
Now, most of us are now able to go and have a drink, but I've been asked that the guests of the sponsors should remain behind just for a couple of moments, because I think you want to have group photographs, and thought it would be easier if you did this at this point rather than wait till everybody's got mixed up in the general drinks. So thank you very much, and please
thank
do
you
come
very
forward.
much.